welcome back to Camera Talk with Scott. This is, excuse me, the fourth video. In our previous video, we talked about mirrorless versus DSLR cameras and which direction to go, and the direction I went, which was I went with a DSLR, versus why mirrorless may be right for some people versus DSLR for other people. And I'll tell you, I went with the older technology. I thought it was more reliable, and it was something I was comfortable with, which is probably why I went with it. So you made that decision, whether it be mirrorless or DSLR. You made that decision, which brings you back to your next decision, which is format. When we talk about format, we're talking about ultimately in all of these, in digital cameras, you have a sensor in the back of the camera that captures the light. And when we talk about format, we're talking about that sensor and how big it is geographically, actually physically, and the types of sensors that are on it. And there are a variety of different formats you can consider. I'm going to talk about each of them, and then I'm going to go from the most expensive options to the least expensive options. And then we'll go from there. Now, the first and most expensive option you can go with is what's called medium format. And medium format, by the way, was also a format that existed in film as well. These are professional, serious professional grade cameras. Now, when I'm talking about this grade, I want to put a picture on a magazine cover, or I want to put a 16 by 20 poster, and I want it so that no one can see the individual dots. This is medium format. These are very large cameras. They typically are like the size of a small box, not big box, but like half a shoebox or so is most of them. They tend to give you very good image quality, incredible detail, and the dynamic range of the images, the colors that you'll see with them are incredible. So, really good. So why don't I go with medium format? The answer is almost always one of two things. They're bulky, and they tend to be incredibly expensive. Both the initial camera that you'd buy it, and when you go to buy lenses, you'll need to buy medium format lenses, and the lenses get very expensive very fast. And if you're like me, I've had the camera now for about 3 months, and I've got 12 lenses already because I want to try a bunch of different ones. I'm going to resell some of them eventually. So medium format is great, but it is a budget buster in terms of when you get into the photography and into buying all these lenses. And they're just heavy, and I want to be able to carry my camera around, and it was just too heavy. So medium format, you obviously can tell, I did not go medium format. If you are thinking about going like high-end professional, like magazine-style cover, big, huge poster kind of stuff, you're probably ultimately going to be looking at a medium format camera. And by the way, I did own a medium format film camera for several months, and the film processing was so prohibitive. 4 pictures, it cost me like $20 to process, and it would take 3 weeks because I had to ship it out to a special place. I did have it. I love it, but it is very expensive. So let's go from medium format to the next format, which is what's called full frame. Full frame is the kind of the largest of the normal sensors, the way I call it. They give you really good image quality. They're really known well for low light performance and wide field of view. They have a good depth of field. They're really good for portrait photography. If you had to compare medium format versus the next couple of formats, it's a good balance between the two. So it kind of hits that happy medium almost. But, and here's the big but, is that full frame camera lenses tend to be slightly more expensive. Not a bunch actually, but the lenses tend to be a lot more expensive because the lenses have to be bigger, and the cameras tend to be a little bit, not a lot bigger, but in my experience, a little bit bigger. Always exceptions. I'm sure someone's going to come back and say, oh no, full frame is the same size as the next one. But the lenses do, in general, tend to be more expensive, and the camera tends to be more expensive. So, again, if you've got the budget, I'd think about going full frame with the realization that you're going to spend more on lenses. Now, let's talk a little bit about something, because we're going to talk about the next category, which is called APS-c. One of the disadvantages to full frame versus APS-c is that APS-c lenses don't work well on full frame cameras, if they work at all. Depends upon the lens and the camera. APS-c cameras, for the most part, can take full frame lenses. There are some limitations and some weird things that go on, but at least you can put the lens on and use it. So, in general, I'm like, okay, if you go full frame, you're almost committing to full frame lenses and spending that kind of money. If you're going APS-c, you can go both. I've got a couple of full frame lenses for an APS-c camera, and they work. They're a little bit odd. You have to get used to them, but they are there. So, medium format, full frame. Kind of the top of the cream of the crop, the next one down. Which takes us back to our next category, brings us to the next category, which is APS-c. And up until a couple of years ago, if you were talking DSLRs, you were probably talking APS-c. APS-c sensors are slightly smaller, about 25% smaller than the full frame camera. So you think about that little sensor I was talking about, it's about 25% smaller, making them more compact and more affordable. You're still getting really high quality images with them. They're great for everyday photography, travel, and sports. They're particularly good for sports. The focal range gets a little bit better with those. They're great for telephoto work. So if you're doing like really shots of stuff really far away with a big millimeter lens, they work great. The disadvantage to them is that they don't work low. APS-c cameras tend to do less well in low light. And by the way, that is, from my experience, something I've discovered is when I first got back into DSLRs and I went with an APS-c camera, I realized I was doing shots in the morning. I love to do morning wildlife shots. And I realized that the light conditions, which on my old film camera would be terrific, with this APS-c camera were a little bit darker than I'd like, and I'd have to tweak to figure out how to get it to work the best way. So APS-c is pretty much, I would say, argue about 90% now, maybe less now that full frame is becoming more common. But you see an awful lot of APS-c out there, and there are a ton of APS-c lenses out there. Unlike full frame, where you're still kind of getting into it, with APS-c, there's tons of lenses and tons of lens manufacturers out there. Which brings us to our last category, and this is probably, of all of them, the newest. And this is what's called half frame. Half frame is roughly half the size of a full frame. No big surprise. The advantage to them is that in terms of storage on your SD cards, you get twice as many images on your SD card than you do on these other formats. They're very compact and lightweight cameras. They're great for what I'd call casual photography. If you're just a casual photographer, they're great. Blowing up could be a problem, so if you want to expand them and make them big, or cropping and expanding can be a problem. And the detail's just not as good. But they're definitely, for certain segments of you who are just I just want a casual camera, look at the medium formats. They're cheaper. They do a perfectly good, fine thing. If you're just going to post your pictures on the web in like as thumbnails or maybe over slightly sized images, probably perfectly fine. You don't need a medium format or an APS-c or a full frame. If you want to do big prints and stuff, you probably one I would want to avoid. So, ultimately, what do we want to think about? Medium format cameras, ultimate quality. If you want the best quality you can get in terms of images, that's the way to go. But you're going to pay a price for that, and it's going to get really expensive. Full frame is a pretty good balance between that very expensive of the medium format and the other formats. APS-c, also a good medium balance. Really affordable. They are portable, much more portable than full frame, in my opinion. And if you're doing telephoto long distance shoots, they work really well. Half frame, if you just want something that's really light, really easy to use, I'd go half frame. Each of these styles of cameras has its benefits. I'm not one of those people who say, oh, this is the way you should go. You want to think about each of them. I always end these videos saying, which way did I go? And the answer is I ended up going with APS-c, and that was probably obvious based upon the way I was talking that I went with APS-c. When I bought my first camera about 3 months ago, I didn't know whether I was going to get into the field a lot and was really going to buy into it. I've since drunk the Kool-Aid and I'm doing all sorts of camera stuff, but I wasn't sure when I first got into it. So I wanted to get a used camera that was affordable, that still had high quality. And so I realized that medium format was completely off the table. I wasn't sold by half frame. I thought that was it. Half frame to me almost felt like, if you remember the old disc cameras and the 110mm cameras in the film days, it feels to me like that. I know it's much better, but it's still, I had that feeling about it. It was just too consumer grade for me. Leaving me with full frame versus APS-c. I tend to do a lot of wildlife and telephoto shots, and so I decided that based upon that kind of stuff, I shoot a lot of 200 to 400mm shots of animals. So I decided APS-c was probably the better way to go. Hopefully that gives you your next set of advice. You now have, am I DSLR or mirrorless? That's your first decision. Well, am I digital or film? That's the first question. DSLR or mirrorless? That's your next question. And then, am I medium, full frame, APS-c, or half frame? And that's kind of my third decision. Now, we'll see you in the next video.